My name is James Connelly. I'm a wildlife researcher, 38 years old, and until 6 months ago, I considered myself a rational man. Science had always been my foundation: observable facts, documented evidence, repeatable results. But what happened during those 4 months at Whitetail Research Outpost has shattered everything I thought I knew about our world. Even now, sitting in my apartment in Denver, thousands of miles from Alaska, I find myself checking the locks twice each night and keeping lights on until dawn. Some darkness follows you, no matter how far you run. It began last November. The Alaskan Wildlife Conservation Foundation needed someone to monitor wolf populations through the winter months. A 4-month assignment, 150 miles from Fairbanks, complete isolation after the first snowfall, close the access roads. Most researchers avoided these winter postings, preferring the comfort of civilization to the brutal Alaskan wilderness. But I volunteered immediately. After my divorce the previous spring, the idea of solitude appealed to me. No office politics, no awkward holiday gatherings, just me and my research. A clean break. The foundation offices in Anchorage buzzed with activity when I arrived for my final briefing. Researchers in flannel and down vests hurried between departments, carrying sample containers and field equipment. Dr. Franklin, the project director, welcomed me with a firm handshake and tired eyes. His office walls displayed topographical maps of Alaska marked with research outpost locations, wildlife migration patterns, and climate data. Whitetail Outpost was marked with a red pin near the northernmost edge of the map. "You sure about this, Connelly?" Dr. Franklin had asked as he handed me the operational manuals. 4 months is a long time to be alone. We've had people crack after 2. I'd laughed it off. 15 years of field research, sir. I've done 8-month stretches in Siberia tracking snow leopards. Isolation doesn't bother me. The silence helps me think. He didn't smile back. Instead, he pulled out a satellite phone from his desk drawer and placed it before me. "This is your lifeline. Weekly check-ins every Monday at 10 a.m., no exceptions. If you miss 2 consecutive calls, we send emergency extraction, weather permitting." Understood. Standard protocol. And this. He handed me a small metal case containing a bright orange device. "Emergency beacon. Test it as soon as you arrive. If activated, we'll have coordinates for immediate rescue deployment." I pocketed the device. Has there ever been a situation requiring emergency extraction from Whitetail? Dr. Franklin hesitated. He glanced at the red pin on his map. Just once, last season's researcher Thomas Abernathy requested emergency pickup mid-October before his replacement arrived. Medical emergency. The report cited urgent personal matters. He had family issues. Franklin's tone suggested the conversation was over. When darkness settles in up there and doesn't lift for weeks, it changes people. Trust the protocols. They exist for a reason. I should have paid attention to his warning. I should have asked more questions about why Abernathy had left so suddenly, why the official records were so vague on details. Protocol violation, they'd called it. Now I understand he was just trying to escape. 2 days later, I reported to the small airfield outside Fairbanks. A bitter wind whipped across the tarmac, carrying the first snowflakes of the season. My gear had been packed into heavy, waterproof duffels, research equipment, winter clothing, personal effects, and enough emergency rations to last until the scheduled supply drops. Hank, my bush pilot, was checking the engine of his Cessna when I approached. He was an old-timer, probably in his 60s, with a weathered face that had seen decades of Alaskan winters. His eyes narrowed as he assessed me. "You the new Whitetail researcher?" he asked, wiping his hands on an oil-stained rag. "James Connelly," I confirmed, extending my hand. He shook it briefly. "Hank Peterson, I've been flying these routes 30 years. You ever been to this particular outpost?" "No, but I've worked at similar stations. Denali, Brooks Range, Kluane over in Yukon Territory, he grunted, returning to his pre-flight checks. Whitetail's different, more isolated. Weather patterns up there are unpredictable. Once that first heavy snow comes, you're cut off until spring thaw. No roads, and flying in becomes near impossible most days. I helped load my equipment into the aircraft's storage compartment. The Foundation briefed me on the conditions. I'm prepared for the isolation. Hank had been unusually quiet during our flight, banking the small Cessna over glacier-carved valleys and endless pine forests. The scenery below was breathtaking, pristine wilderness stretching to every horizon, mountains jutting from the earth like ancient sentinels, rivers carving through valleys in silver ribbons. Winter was already asserting its dominance at these northern latitudes, snow capping the peaks and creeping down toward the valleys. Last chance to back out, he'd said as we approached the small clearing that served as a landing strip, his voice crackling through the headset. Nobody would blame you. I'll be fine, I assured him. Plus, the pay bonus for winter isolation is going to fund my next expedition to Mongolia. Money's no good to a dead man, he'd muttered, but I pretended not to hear, focusing instead on my first glimpse of Whitetail Outpost through the windshield. The complex came into view, a main cabin built from weathered timber, a smaller storage shed, and a generator housing. Solar panels caught the fading light on the pitched roof, and a communications array pointed its satellite dish skyward. 6 perimeter cameras on tall poles surrounded the clearing, designed to track wildlife movements without human interference. Standard equipment for any remote research station, yet something about the configuration struck me as defensive, as if the cameras were watching for intruders rather than wildlife. We landed with a gentle bump on the crude airstrip, the plane's skids finding purchase on the hard-packed dirt. The air that greeted me as I stepped from the Cessna was sharp, clean, and brutally cold, the kind of cold that makes your lungs ache with each breath. The surrounding forest was primarily pine and spruce, their dark green boughs heavy with early snow. Beyond them rose the jagged peaks of unnamed mountains, their summits already lost in gathering storm clouds. What I noticed first when we landed was the silence, absolute and consuming. Even the wind seemed hesitant to disturb the stillness. No birds called, no branches creaked. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I'll help you unload, Hank said, but I need to be airborne before dark. Weather system moving in from the north could ground me for days if I don't get ahead of it. We worked efficiently, moving supplies from the plane to the cabin porch. The entire time, Hank kept glancing at the tree line, as if expecting to see something emerge. I attributed his unease to the approaching weather. Bush pilots lived and died by their ability to read conditions. The interior of the cabin was warm, but felt abandoned. A half-empty coffee mug sat on the desk. Papers were strewn across the floor near the filing cabinet. A chair had been overturned. Abernathy's personal items were still in the dresser drawer, a photo of a woman, several paperbacks, a journal locked with a small padlock. It looked as though he'd left in a hurry, contrary to the official report of a scheduled departure. The cabin itself was larger than it appeared from outside. A main living area with research equipment, a small kitchenette, a partitioned sleeping area, and a storage room. The walls were lined with bookshelves containing field guides, research journals, and survival manuals. A wood-burning stove dominated one corner, already stocked with split logs. A diesel generator hummed quietly outside, powering the lights and essential equipment. The research station was impressive. 3 computer monitors displayed feeds from the perimeter cameras, weather data, and wildlife tracking software. A satellite uplink system occupied its own desk near the communications array. The Foundation had spared no expense on technology, making the apparent haste of Abernathy's departure all the more puzzling. Hank helped me bring in the last of the supplies, his eyes constantly checking the darkening sky. Check-ins are Mondays at 10 a.m., he reminded me. You missed 2 in a row, we send rescue. Though in winter weather, that could take weeks. He paused at the door. Don't forget to test the emergency beacon as soon as I leave. And James, stay inside after dark. Before I could ask why, he was gone, hurrying back to his plane. Within minutes, the sound of the Cessna's engine faded into the vastness, leaving me truly alone. I spent the remaining daylight unpacking and organizing my supplies. The pantry was stocked with non-perishable foods, canned goods, dried fruits, vacuum-sealed meats, pasta, rice, and an impressive selection of freeze-dried meals. I had enough coffee to fuel an army and, to my surprise, a cabinet containing a respectable collection of whiskey and bourbon. Apparently, the Foundation understood the realities of winter isolation. That first night, I settled into establishing my workspace. The outpost was well designed for long-term habitation. A wood stove with ample dry firewood, a diesel generator with backup fuel, solar battery storage, propane cooking range, and enough preserved food to last 6 months. The research station included advanced computer systems, satellite uplink, and monitoring software for the perimeter cameras. I spent my first evening reviewing Abernathy's notes but found them oddly incomplete. His observation logs began normally enough, detailed records of wolf movements, feeding patterns, territorial behaviors, but by late September, the entries became increasingly erratic. His handwriting, initially neat and precise, grew jagged and rushed. He began noting anomalous behaviors in the wolf pack without specifying what those behaviors were. His final entries were abbreviated, sometimes just single words: movement, watching, cold. His last entry, dated October 15th, simply read, "They know." Yet, according to the Foundation, Abernathy had filed a complete report upon his extraction on October 18th. Something didn't add up. I dismissed it as cabin fever and turned my attention to establishing my own protocols. Wake at 7 a.m., breakfast, equipment check, morning observations, lunch, data processing, afternoon observations, dinner, personal time, sleep by 11 p.m. Structure would keep me sane through the long darkness. My research objectives were clearly defined. Document wolfpack behaviors during winter months, monitor hunting patterns, observe adaptations to extreme cold, record territorial changes, and collect data on pack interactions with other wildlife. I would use thermal imaging to track movements at night and standard video during daylight hours. The first 2 weeks passed uneventfully. I documented the movements of a wolf pack, 7 adults and 3 juveniles, that had established territory about 2 miles northeast of the outpost. Their behavior was textbook: organized hunting patterns, clear hierarchy, regular territorial markings. The alpha pair, which I named Magnus and Aurora, led hunting expeditions with remarkable efficiency. I sent my first reports during the scheduled Monday check-ins and received confirmation that my data was being received without issue. November in Alaska means watching daylight diminish like water draining from a tub. Each day brought fewer minutes of sunlight than the last. By late November, the sun barely crested the horizon before beginning its descent again, casting the forest in perpetual twilight. Snow fell almost daily, transforming the landscape into a monochrome painting of whites and grays. I kept the wood stove burning constantly. Then came the first anomaly. I woke one morning to find fresh tracks in the snow circling the cabin, too large for a wolf, too small for a bear, and with a gait pattern I couldn't identify. The stride length suggested something bipedal, but with an unusual foot shape. They appeared to start from the tree line, circle the outpost twice, then stop abruptly at the storage shed door before disappearing, not fading away or continuing elsewhere, simply ending, as if whatever made them had vanished or been lifted away. I photographed them, took measurements, and consulted my wildlife identification guides. Nothing matched. I told myself it was probably snowshoe hair tracks, distorted by wind or partial melting, but even as I documented this explanation, I knew it was wrong. The precision of the circuit around my cabin suggested purpose, not the random wanderings of forest wildlife. That evening, camera 3 went offline. The monitoring software showed no malfunction, no power loss, no connection error. It simply stopped sending a signal. According to protocol, I would need to check it the following morning. I barely slept that night. The silence of the outpost had changed character, no longer peaceful but expectant. Listening, I kept the lights on until dawn, jumpier than I cared to admit. Every creak of the cabin's timber frame made me flinch. Twice, I thought I heard breathing outside my window, but when I checked, there was only swirling snow in the darkness. The next morning brought heavy snowfall, so I delayed the camera inspection until visibility improved. I used the time to review my research objectives and prepare my weekly report for the foundation. Through the kitchen window, the forest appeared benign in daylight, just snow-laden branches and white ground, beautiful in its austerity. By afternoon, the weather had cleared and I geared up to check camera 3. I dressed in layers, thermal underwear, wool pants, insulated snow pants, 3 upper layers topped with a heavy down parka. Standard procedure advised carrying a rifle for protection against wildlife, particularly wolverines or the occasional wolf. I'd never felt the need to fire it, but its weight across my back was reassuring as I trudged through knee-deep snow. Camera 3 stood at the northwest perimeter, overlooking a natural game trail that descended toward a frozen creek. As I approached, I immediately saw the problem. The camera housing had been physically rotated 180 degrees, now pointing at the outpost instead of the forest. The locking mechanism that secured its position had been broken, metal housing bent as if by tremendous force. No animal could have done this. The camera was 15 feet up the pole. I stood motionless, scanning the tree line. The forest was silent. Not even wind disturbed the branches. My breath formed clouds in the frigid air as my mind raced through explanations. Another researcher playing a prank. Impossible. I was the only human within 100 miles. Equipment failure causing the housing to rotate. The bent metal suggested deliberate force, not mechanical malfunction. I reset the camera, secured it as best I could with the tools I'd brought, and hurried back to the cabin, scanning the tree line constantly. The forest felt different now, less empty, more attentive. The shadows between the pines seemed deeper than they should be, even in the fading light. Back inside, I triple-checked the locks and reviewed the last footage from camera 3 before it was tampered with. The final frames showed nothing unusual, just swaying branches and falling snow, then black. Whatever had rotated the camera had either avoided being recorded or had done so during the night when thermal imaging would have detected any warm-bodied creature. That evening, while monitoring the feeds, I noticed the wolf pack had altered its movements. They now gave the outpost a wide berth, staying at least 5 miles away according to camera 6. Animals often adjusted their territories in response to environmental factors, but this change seemed abrupt and deliberate. Magnus, the alpha, had previously shown curiosity about the outpost, occasionally approaching within 100 yards before rejoining his pack. Now he actively led them away, even when prey was spotted in the vicinity. A week passed with no further incidents. I almost convinced myself the camera had been damaged by extreme cold or wind. Almost. Then came December, and with it, the true darkness. The sun now appeared as little more than a brief lightening of the southern horizon around noon before surrendering to the night. Temperatures plummeted to -30. The scheduled supply drop was canceled due to weather conditions, though I had ample provisions. My Monday check-ins became increasingly difficult as atmospheric conditions interfered with the satellite signal. I had to reposition the dish 3 times before establishing a weak connection. During my check-in, Dr. Franklin's voice broke through the static. "Connelly, we've received your data packages, some concerning patterns in the transmission crackled. Reports of unusual wildlife displacement. Previous researchers also noted more static. Not confirmed, but be alert for." Then the connection died completely. I spent an hour attempting to re-establish contact but succeeded only in receiving a text message. Atmospheric conditions prohibit voice communications. Continue weekly data transmission. Next supply window, January 15th, weather permitting. That night, I dreamed of eyes watching me from the forest edge. Not animal eyes, but something older, patient, aware. I woke to find my research notes rearranged on my desk, though I was certain I'd left them in the drawer. Sleep deprivation, I told myself. I'm becoming disorganized. The isolation is affecting me more than I realized. I threw myself into my research with renewed vigor, maintaining my strict schedule and detailed documentation. The wolf pack had moved even farther from the outpost, now barely visible on the outermost cameras. I expanded my observation radius, using satellite imagery to track their new territory. They'd established a pattern that explicitly avoided a 5-mile radius around Whitetail Outpost, something unprecedented in my experience. While searching for a backup hard drive the next day, I discovered a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards under Abernathy's bed. The boards had been carefully cut and replaced, nearly invisible unless you knew to look for them. Inside was a journal different from the one I'd found earlier, this one unlocked and filled with frantic handwriting. November 30th. They're coming closer each night. I've seen them on the cameras. Management insists it's nothing but equipment glitches. They're lying. December 5th. Found symbols carved into the trees half a mile out. Not human, not animal. What makes these marks? The Foundation knows. They've seen this before. December 12th. They stood outside my window last night, watching, not breathing. How can they stand so still in this cold? The supply drop was cancelled again. I think they're leaving me here. December 20th. The wolves know. They've abandoned the entire region. Smart. I tried the emergency beacon today. No response. The satellite phone is picking up voices that aren't transmission signals. The entries continued, growing more incoherent, until the final page, dated January 10th. They're not from here, not from anywhere that makes sense. The darkness brings them, only darkness. The Foundation sent me here as bait. Observation goes both ways. If anyone finds this, burn this place, burn it all. But Abernathy had supposedly left in October, not January. The official records were wrong, or deliberately falsified. I sat on the floor beside the hidden compartment, the journal in my trembling hands, as darkness fell outside. Abernathy had either descended into paranoid delusion during his isolation, or he had encountered something at Whitetail that defied explanation. Neither possibility was comforting. That evening, during my routine check of the camera feeds, I noticed movement at the edge of camera 7's range. At first, I thought it was a moose. The height and mass suggested something large, but when I zoomed in, the image quality deteriorated into pixels. I could make out only a vague silhouette moving with unsettling fluidity between the trees. Not a wolf, not a bear, which would be hibernating anyway. The shape appeared almost humanoid but moved wrong, too smooth, too quick for its size. I enhanced the footage, applying various filters to clarify the image. Nothing helped. If anything, the more I attempted to bring the figure into focus, the more distorted it became, as if the subject itself rejected documentation. I spent hours reviewing the footage frame by frame, but the figure remained indistinct, always just beyond clear visibility. I tried enhancing the images using the station's software, but this only distorted them further, as if the digital representation couldn't properly render whatever I was seeing. I switched to thermal imaging, but the results were even more confounding. Where the figure had been, the thermal camera showed only cold, an absence of heat where there should have been a warm signature from any living creature, a void moving purposefully through the forest. I stayed up all night, watching the feeds, checking and rechecking the locks. Nothing further appeared on the cameras, but twice I heard sounds from the roof, soft footsteps moving from one end to the other, pausing directly above where I sat. The next morning, exhausted and on edge, I forced myself to maintain routine. I made breakfast, recorded weather data, and tested the satellite uplink. No signal. I tried the emergency beacon, but the confirmation light remained dark. The generator failed despite being fully fueled and recently serviced. I spent 4 hours in the bitter cold repairing it, constantly looking over my shoulder, feeling watched from all sides. As darkness fell, I hurried inside, hands numb despite heavy gloves. That night, I heard it for the first time, scratching at the walls. Gentle at first, it could have been branches moved by wind, but there was no wind. The scratching continued, methodical, moving slowly around the perimeter of the cabin, claws or fingernails against wood. Testing, seeking weakness. It paused at each window, at each door, before continuing its circuit. 3 complete rotations before it stopped directly outside my bedroom wall. I sat frozen on my bed, rifle aimed at the wall, for what felt like hours. Just as I convinced myself it was gone, I heard a new sound, soft tapping on the glass, like fingernails seeking attention. I did not look. I knew instinctively that making eye contact would be catastrophic. Dawn brought relief and fresh snow that covered any tracks around the cabin. I searched anyway, finding nothing but pristine white powder. Had I imagined the night's events? Was I succumbing to the same paranoia that had apparently claimed Abernathy? I made a desperate attempt to contact the Foundation, first by satellite phone, then by emergency beacon. Neither worked. The computers functioned normally, allowing me to record data but unable to transmit it. I was completely cut off. The next week brought increasing incidents. Camera 4 was found uprooted entirely, the metal pole twisted like a corkscrew. The generator failed nightly despite functioning perfectly during daylight hours. The wolf pack disappeared entirely from my observation range. No thermal signatures, no tracks, no howls in the night. Gone. By Christmas, I was sleeping in 3-hour increments, the rifle beside my bed. I'd begun keeping a detailed log of incidents, camera failures, now averaging 1 per day, unexplained noises, equipment malfunctions, and strange tracks that appeared and disappeared impossibly. I started moving furniture against the doors each night and sleeping in the main room near the wood stove, the only reliable heat source. The solitude of Christmas Day brought a terrible clarity. I was no longer conducting research. I was under siege. From what? I couldn't say, but the pretense of scientific observation had become absurd. I was now the subject of the observation. I spent the day fortifying the cabin as best I could, covering windows with blankets secured by duct tape, reinforcing door frames with spare lumber, creating noise traps from cans and fishing line. I inventoried my ammunition, sufficient for defense but not for a protracted conflict. Against what? I couldn't articulate even to myself. I used the satellite phone to make an emergency call, but reached only an automated message system. I left detailed coordinates and a request for immediate evacuation, citing medical emergency. No one called back. The turning point came in early January, during a rare clear day. The sun wouldn't crest the horizon, but the southern sky lightened to deep blue for about 3 hours around noon. I needed to check the solar panels, which had accumulated snow and weren't charging the backup batteries efficiently. I worked quickly, constantly scanning my surroundings. That's when I noticed them, markings carved into the trunks of several pines at the forest edge. Compelled by a reckless need to understand, I approached. The snow was deep, each step requiring effort. The symbols were unlike anything I'd seen, not letters or numbers or pictographs, yet clearly intentional. They formed patterns that suggested language or code, carved deep into the living wood with precision. The tree sap that leaked from the cuts was frozen black. Following the marked trees, I discovered something Abernathy had mentioned. A small cave entrance partially hidden by fallen timber about a quarter mile from the outpost. It wasn't on any of my maps. The opening was roughly 4 feet high, requiring me to stoop to enter. Snow had drifted across the entrance but showed signs of recent disturbance. I should have turned back, but scientific curiosity overwhelmed my fear. The narrow entrance widened into a chamber about 12 feet in diameter. My flashlight revealed crude stone tools, charred bone fragments, and more of those strange symbols etched into the cave walls. But most disturbing was the evidence of recent use: fresh ash in the fire pit, scraps of modern clothing, and what appeared to be a damaged camera battery from our equipment. In one corner lay a collection of personal items that sent ice through my veins. A Foundation-issued watch, a pocket knife with initials, T.A., Thomas Abernathy, and several laminated identification cards from previous researchers. Some dated back decades. All had been systematically defaced, the eyes scratched out with sharp implements. Someone or something was living here, using this space, watching the outpost, watching me, collecting from those who came before. I fled back to the cabin as the brief daylight faded, convinced something followed me just beyond the beam of my flashlight. Twice I turned, seeing nothing but feeling pressure in the air, as if the space behind me was being compressed by an approaching form. Inside, I barricaded the door and windows, then spent the night reviewing weeks of archived camera footage. A pattern emerged. The figure, sometimes alone, sometimes with others, appeared every seventh day, always at dusk, always approaching from the north. Today was the seventh day since I'd last seen movement on camera 7. Abernathy's coded warnings suddenly made sense. The previous researcher had documented the same phenomena, tracking the pattern until what? Until they came for him. The official record claimed he'd been extracted on October 18th, but his hidden journal continued until January. Either he'd been abandoned here or the alternative was unthinkable. I gathered every document I could find about the area's history. Among the research station's files was a folder labeled Local Lore, Non-Scientific. Inside were newspaper clippings about missing hikers dating back to the 1950s, all disappearing during winter months. Also included were translated excerpts from indigenous legends about winter stalkers, beings that emerged from another world when darkness dominated the land. They were described as collectors of consciousness, harvesters of awareness. According to the legends, they studied humans as we studied animals, with cold curiosity and methodical precision. One account from 1978 described a sole survivor from a group of 4 hikers found wandering the forest in a hypothermic daze. Before he died at Fairbanks Medical Center, he spoke of shadows that walked like men that had taken his companions one by one. His final recorded words were, "They didn't want their bodies, they wanted what was inside." Local tribal elders refused to discuss the entities directly, referring to them only as the Watchers, or those who wait for darkness. Their territories were marked on no maps, acknowledged by no government agency, but universally avoided by indigenous hunters. I found a hand-drawn map from 1962, created by Foundation researcher Dr. Harold Mitchell. It showed a 50-mile radius with Whitetail Outpost at its center, marked with a simple annotation. Observable range of phenomenon, do not establish permanent residence. Observation periods not to exceed 60 days. Yet here I was, approaching 90 days of continuous occupation. 2 nights later, during a violent blizzard, the power failed completely. The generator wouldn't start. The battery backups drained within hours. By midnight, my only light came from the wood stove, my only heat from the flames. The scratching returned, louder now, more insistent. No longer testing, now seeking entrance. The windows rattled in their frames. The door handles turned slowly back and forth. I huddled in the center of the main room, rifle aimed at each sound in turn, using the thermal scope to scan for heat signatures. There were none, despite the continued assault on the cabin's exterior. My satellite phone showed no signal. The emergency beacon appeared to function but received no acknowledgement. I was completely cut off. Using the last of my laptop's battery power, I checked the final camera feeds. The thermal imaging showed multiple figures surrounding the outpost, moving with coordinated purpose. The regular cameras showed only darkness, as if the figures absorbed light rather than reflected it. A window shattered in the bedroom. I heard glass tinkling onto the floor, followed by that same methodical scratching now inside the cabin. I fired 3 rounds through the bedroom door. The noise stopped momentarily, then resumed, now accompanied by a soft, rhythmic clicking sound, almost like communication. The siege continued for 3 days. I rationed my food and firewood, maintaining the wood stove as my last defense. The entities seemed to retreat somewhat in daylight, but each night brought renewed attempts to enter. The scratching became pounding, then something worse, a persistent, patient dismantling of the outpost's protective shell. They were taking the cabin apart, piece by piece. I retreated to the storage room, the most defensible position with only one entrance. I constructed a barricade of furniture and equipment, keeping the rifle trained on the door. I didn't sleep. I couldn't risk it. The sounds of slow deconstruction surrounded me. Roof shingles peeled away individually, window frames methodically disassembled, siding removed nail by nail. I could hear them in the walls, moving between the interior and exterior sheeting. By January 30th, a brief improvement in weather conditions offered my only chance. The forecast from my weather station predicted 6 hours of clear sky, enough time to potentially reach the emergency shelter marked on my maps, approximately 10 miles south. I prepared my emergency pack with survival essentials, ammunition, flares, and what remained of my documentation. Abernathy's journal went into a waterproof pouch against my chest. My plan was to use the snowmobile stored in the shed to cover distance quickly before the entities returned in full force at nightfall. As soon as the sky lightened to deep blue, the closest thing to daylight in January at this latitude, I made my move. The cabin was barely recognizable after 3 days of siege. Entire sections of the roof had been removed. The north wall was half dismantled. The research equipment lay in ruins. I fought through knee-deep snow to the storage shed, finding the door intact but frozen shut. I broke it open with the butt of my rifle and ducked inside. The snowmobile waited, covered with a tarp. My hopes rose momentarily, only to crash when I pulled the cover away. The snowmobile had been sabotaged, fuel line cut, ignition wires removed, tracks slashed. This wasn't random damage. This was deliberate disabling designed to strand me. I had no choice but to attempt the journey on foot. 10 miles in deep snow in sub-zero temperatures with less than 6 hours of daylight remaining. I set out immediately using snowshoes and the most direct route according to my GPS. The forest was unnervingly quiet as I pushed south. No birds, no small mammals, no sounds but my own labored breathing and the crunch of snow beneath my feet. 3 miles in, I heard it. Branches breaking behind me. I increased my pace, no longer concerned with conserving energy. Survival depended on reaching the shelter before darkness. 5 miles from the outpost, I glanced back. Dark figures moved between the trees, keeping pace effortlessly. They didn't rush, didn't call out. They simply followed, confident in the coming darkness, confident in my inevitable exhaustion. I tried changing direction, heading southwest instead of due south, thinking I might confuse them or find easier terrain. The strategy failed. The figures adjusted their course immediately, maintaining the same distance. They weren't tracking me by sight or sound. They knew where I was going. By mile 7, the daylight was fading. My legs burned with exhaustion, my lungs raw from the frigid air. According to my map, I needed to cross a frozen stream and ascend a gentle slope to reach the emergency shelter. As I navigated down the embankment toward the ice, my foot broke through a hidden air pocket. I fell hard, my ankle twisting beneath me. The pain was immediate and severe, not broken, but badly sprained. I couldn't put full weight on it. My pace slowed to an agonizing limp, each step sending jolts of pain up my leg. The sun touched the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. I could feel them closing in behind me. Just as despair threatened to overwhelm me, I spotted a structure through the trees. Not the modern emergency shelter I'd expected, but an old hunter's cabin, weathered and partially collapsed on one side. Shelter nonetheless. I dragged myself the final quarter mile as twilight deepened into dusk. The figures were visible now in my peripheral vision, keeping pace just inside the tree line, moving with that same unsettling fluidity. They made no sound. They didn't need to hurry. Night was their ally. The cabin door was frozen shut. I smashed it open with the butt of my rifle and fell inside, immediately pushing a heavy table against the entrance. The interior was Spartan, a wood stove, a simple bed frame, shelves with ancient canned goods, and, miraculously, a hand-crank emergency radio of the type used by Forest Service rangers. I built a fire with frantic haste, using the cabin's remaining firewood and furniture, light, heat. These were my only defenses. As darkness claimed the forest, the siege began anew. The scratching surrounded the cabin on all sides. The roof creaked as something moved across it. The small window frosted over repeatedly, then cleared, as if something pressed against it, breathing, watching. I tried the radio, turning the hand crank until my arm cramped. Static greeted me across all frequencies until finally, on the emergency channel, a voice broke through. "This is Fairbanks Rescue Operations receiving your distress call. Identify yourself and nature of emergency. Over." I nearly wept with relief. James Connelly, wildlife researcher at Whitetail Outpost. Currently sheltering in Hunter's cabin at coordinates 64, 8° N, 147, 6° W, medical emergency, possible frostbite, requesting immediate evacuation. The window rattled violently. The temperature in the cabin dropped suddenly, my breath visible despite the roaring fire. Understood, Connelly. Weather conditions prohibit immediate air rescue. Earliest window for helicopter extraction is 48 hours. Can you maintain position until then? The window rattled violently. The temperature in the cabin dropped suddenly, my breath visible despite the roaring fire. No choice, I replied. 2 days, I'll be here. Conserve your battery. We'll contact you with updates. Fairbanks rescue out. The radio went silent, leaving me alone with the intensifying sounds of probing and testing around the cabin. Unlike the outpost, this simple structure had no technological defenses, no reinforced doors, no satellite communications, just wooden walls between me and them. I took inventory of my resources. Half a cord of firewood stacked by the stove, enough for maybe 30 hours if I rationed carefully. 3 flares, 17 rifle rounds, emergency rations for 4 days, a first aid kit with painkillers that I immediately used for my throbbing ankle, a kerosene lamp with enough fuel for 1 night, my flashlight with fading batteries. The scratching intensified as full darkness settled. I could hear them moving around the cabin, communicating with those clicking sounds. Occasionally a thud would shake the walls, as if testing the structural integrity. The roof groaned under weight that shifted methodically from one end to the other. I maintained the fire, adding logs precisely when needed, never allowing the flames to dim. The thermal scope on my rifle showed only cold spots where the entities moved outside, negative space in the heat signature of the world. I fired warning shots when the scratching concentrated too long in one area, driving them temporarily back, but never away completely. That first night was psychological warfare. They didn't break in, though I'm certain they could have. Instead, they maintained constant pressure, sounds, movement, the rattling of the door, fingers testing the seams of window frames. They wanted me exhausted, frightened, irrational. They were studying my responses. I used Abernathy's journal to keep myself awake, reading his observations by firelight. In mid-December, he had noted the same pattern of testing before any direct confrontation. His theory, scribbled in margins and increasingly disjointed, suggested they were not simple predators but investigators. They wanted to understand before they collected. The night stretched endlessly, but eventually the blue-black of deep night lightened to the dim gray of Arctic winter day. The sounds outside faded. The pressure against the door ceased. I used the respite to dress my ankle, eat a meager breakfast, and reposition furniture into a defensive barrier around the wood stove. The center of the cabin became my fortress within a fortress. The radio remained silent despite my attempts to re-establish contact. I conserved the battery, cranking it only hourly to check for transmissions. Nothing came through. I inspected the cabin more thoroughly in daylight. The previous occupant had left few personal items, a moth-eaten coat, rusted trapping equipment, fishing gear, but I found something valuable beneath the bed frame. A journal dating to 1983, written by a trapper named Jeremiah Cole. Cole had documented his own encounters with what he called the winter people. His descriptions matched what I'd experienced. The systematic testing of defenses, the coordinated hunting behavior, the inability to capture them on film. This was pre-digital, but he had noted that his photographs of the entities always developed blank. Most valuable was his discovery that certain materials repelled them, specifically iron and certain combinations of herbs he had learned from local indigenous people. He had lined his cabin threshold with iron nails and kept bundles of dried plants hanging by each window. I found remnants of these deterrents, now decades old and likely ineffective, but the knowledge itself was valuable. Using tools from the sparse collection on a shelf, I pried nails from less essential parts of the cabin and hammered them into the doorframe and window sills. I couldn't reproduce the herbal mixtures, but the iron alone might help. Cole's journal suggested it wasn't a complete barrier but caused them discomfort. The second day passed intense preparation. I gathered everything flammable into carefully measured piles. I fashioned torches from chair legs wrapped with strips of curtain fabric soaked in kerosene. I positioned my remaining flares for maximum defensive coverage. My ankle throbbed despite the painkillers, but I could move with a hobbled gait. The radio crackled to life at dusk. Rescue operations to Connelly. Weather window confirmed for 0700 tomorrow. Helicopter departing at first light. Maintain your position. Over. Understood, I replied. Be advised, approach with caution. Situation complicated. Over. Copy that. Any immediate threats to be aware of. Over. I hesitated. What could I say? Beware of shadow entities that don't register on thermal imaging. Bring iron and herbs. Wildlife presence, I said finally. Approach with caution. Over and out. Night fell like a shroud. The siege resumed with increased intensity. The scratching became clawing, then pounding. The roof buckled in one corner as something heavy moved across it deliberately. The window glass developed fractures from precise, repeated pressure. Not enough to break it, just enough to weaken it systematically. They were accelerating their timeline. They knew help was coming. I maintained my position by the stove, keeping the fire roaring, rifle aimed at the door. The barricaded furniture shifted slightly with each impact against the walls. The temperature inside the cabin plummeted. Despite the fire, my breath visible in cloudy puffs. Around midnight, a new tactic. The clicking sounds changed pitch, becoming almost musical, mesmerizing. An overwhelming drowsiness washed over me. My eyelids grew heavy, my thoughts sluggish. I fought to stay awake, pinching myself, focusing on the pain in my ankle, anything to maintain consciousness. The melody of clicks continued, weaving patterns that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my brain. I fired a shot into the ceiling. The noise shattered the hypnotic effect momentarily, returning my senses. The clicking stopped, replaced by what I can only describe as hissing, a sound of frustration or anger. The physical assault intensified. A portion of the roof gave way, snow and frigid air pouring through the new opening. I aimed my flashlight upward, catching a glimpse of something withdrawing from the hole. Long, jointed limbs the color of twilight, too many for any known animal, moving with precision that suggested intelligence. I fired at the opening, emptying 3 rounds into the night. A high-pitched keening followed, not of pain, but communication. The assault paused briefly, then resumed with new focus. They began dismantling the north wall systematically, removing boards with surgical precision. Cold air flooded through the widening gaps. The fire guttered. I moved my defensive position, dragging myself and my supplies to the southwest corner where the walls remained intact. I kept the fire going with the last of the furniture, breaking the bed frame for its wooden slats. The lamp provided additional light but was running low on kerosene. By 3 a.m., the cabin was half exposed to the elements. Snow drifted through gaps in the walls and roof. The wind cut through my layers like knives. I wore everything I had, all my spare clothing, blankets wrapped as cloaks, but the cold was beyond physical endurance. My fingers grew numb, my thoughts slowed. Through the gaps in the walls, I could finally see them clearly. They moved in the darkness with liquid grace, their forms suggesting humanoid shape, but wrong in fundamental ways. Too tall, too angular, with movements that defied joint limitations. Their skin, if it could be called that, absorbed light rather than reflected it, creating void-like silhouettes against the snow. Their eyes, I cannot describe their eyes except to say they did not observe as animals or humans observe. They studied with ancient intelligence, assessed, calculated. They worked in coordinated patterns, communicating through those clicking sounds, systematically reducing my shelter to an increasingly smaller space. They were not merely destroying, they were hurting me, containing me, reducing my options with cold efficiency. I burned Abernathy's journal for additional light and heat, page by page, reading his final warnings one last time before consigning them to flame. His words now made terrible sense. They don't want your body, they want what's inside, they want to know how you know. At 5 a.m., with the cabin reduced to little more than a corner of 2 walls and partial roof, one of the entities breached my inner defensive line. It moved through a gap between furniture pieces I could have sworn was too narrow, flowing like shadow given form. In the firelight, I finally saw it fully. No description can capture the wrongness of its appearance. Bipedal but with too many joints, digits too long and numerous, a face, if it could be called that, without features except those eyes. Dozens of them, covering what should have been a head, each moving independently, focusing and unfocusing as if each operated with separate awareness. I fired my last rounds directly into its center mass. The bullets passed through without resistance, leaving no mark. It paused, not in pain, but apparent curiosity, those eyes shifting to examine its own form where the bullets had passed harmlessly through. In desperation, I grabbed an iron nail from my pocket and thrust it forward. The effect was immediate. The entity recoiled, those eyes blinking rapidly, the form rippling as if in distress. It retreated through the wall gap, rejoining others outside. Their clicking communication intensified, becoming frantic, strategic. I discharged flares through the broken roof, briefly illuminating twisted forms that retreated from the magnesium glare. The forest beyond was filled with movement. Dozens of entities, more than I had imagined, gathered for what I now understood was not just an attack, but a collection. The pre-dawn hours brought increased frenzy to their efforts. The remaining walls began to give way. The fire dwindled to embers despite my efforts. With numb fingers, I cranked the radio one last time. Connelly to rescue, please, expedite, situation critical. My voice sounded strange even to myself, slurred from cold and exhaustion. Rescue to Connelly, inbound, 20 minutes out, hold position. 20 minutes, an eternity. The eastern sky lightened imperceptibly from black to deep blue. The entities became increasingly desperate, their movements more erratic, less coordinated. They feared the coming light, however dim it might be at this latitude in January. Just as the last wall began to collapse, I heard it, the distant thrum of helicopter rotors. Dawn was breaking. The entities became increasingly frenzied, their assault on the cabin reaching a desperate pitch. They knew their time was ending. The helicopter appeared over the tree line as the first direct sunlight struck the clearing. The entities retreated into the shadows, their movements now hurried, almost panicked. The downdraft from the rotors cleared the remaining snow from what remained of the roof, exposing the cabin fully to daylight. The rescue team found me semi-conscious, suffering from hypothermia, smoke inhalation, and dehydration. They commented on the unusual damage to the cabin, but attributed it to weather and wildlife. As they lifted me into the helicopter, I saw the tree line, empty now, waiting. Recovery in Fairbanks was physical only. The hospital treated my ankle, the frostbite on my extremities, and my respiratory issues. They attributed my delusions to extended isolation, hypothermia, and possible carbon monoxide exposure from the cabin's wood stove. No one believed my account of what had happened at Whitetail. Dr. Franklin visited once, his expression guarded as I recounted my experiences. He took notes, asked specific questions about times and dates, but offered no confirmation of similar reports. When I mentioned Abernathy's journal, he claimed no knowledge of any researcher staying beyond October. The official records, he insisted, were accurate. Isolation can play tricks on the mind, he said, patting my shoulder condescendingly. The winter darkness affects everyone differently. Rest now. But his eyes told a different story. He knew. The Foundation knew. I provided my official report to the Alaskan Wildlife Conservation Foundation, carefully omitting the inexplicable elements. They accepted my edited account without question, perhaps relieved I hadn't inquired about the discrepancies in Abernathy's records or the true purpose of Whitetail Outpost. 2 weeks later, the Foundation announced that Whitetail Research Outpost was officially closed, cited for budget constraints and safety concerns. The equipment was removed by helicopter, no ground team was sent. I discovered the mark 1 month after my return to civilization, a small symbol etched into my skin like a brand, identical to those I'd found carved into the trees near the outpost. It appeared on my left forearm, though I have no memory of receiving it. Doctors suggested it was a cold injury I'd overlooked, though none could explain its precise geometric pattern. The mark doesn't heal, it doesn't fade. Sometimes, in certain light, it seems to shift slightly when I'm not looking directly at it. 6 months have passed. I've left field research behind, taking a teaching position at a university in Colorado. Mountains still surround me, but these mountains welcome the sun, hold no secrets in their forests. The perpetual daylight of summer has been healing, but I know winter is coming. I know darkness will return. Yesterday, I saw a news report that made my blood freeze. The Alaskan Wildlife Conservation Foundation has reopened Whitetail Outpost under a new name, Northern Lights Wildlife Monitoring Station. A young researcher named Michael Torres has volunteered for the winter posting, citing the generous isolation bonus and opportunity for uninterrupted study. The report mentioned he arrived on November 1st. I've tried calling the foundation, emailed the director, even attempted to contact Torres directly. My messages go unanswered. My calls are routed to administrators who assure me they'll pass along my concerns. Last night, I dreamed of snow and darkness. I dreamed of eyes watching from the tree line. I dreamed of that cave with its collection of personal effects, now including my own foundation watch, somehow taken without my knowledge during those terrible days. The darkness is returning to Alaska, the long night is beginning again, and I know they're waiting. Sometimes at night, I hear scratching at my apartment walls. Sometimes the lights flicker for no reason. Sometimes I catch glimpses of two tall figures at the edge of campus after sunset. They found something in me, something that interested them. The mark on my arm tells me they're not finished with their research. They're coming for me again, and after me, they'll come for Torres, and after him, whoever follows. The cycle continues. The observation goes both ways, and the darkness grows longer each day.